Good morning, students, and welcome to week 2 of Political Sociology. The lecture today is, as I indicated in an email I sent out this morning, a very, very critical lecture because it lays the groundwork for much of what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the semester. And it introduces the single most important concept to understand the issues we face in the United States, the political dynamic, the level of inequality in wealth and income, and many other aspects of American society. And that is neoliberalism, a term that is widely used. Some of you may have already been exposed to the concept, and it's also widely misunderstood. So it's important for us to delve into that concept and the origins of neoliberalism within the United States. And that's something I want to do in this lecture. This lecture will also be beginning with what I would call some basic political economic concepts informed by Marxist theory, which I think will also enhance your ability to understand what's happening in the American capitalist political economic system. And it's vital. You don't need to have a background in economics. You don't need to have taken micro or macro. In fact, that might have done more damage than good. So I want you to appreciate the fact that there are some economic ideas and concepts that you can merge with politics that brings life to the study of what is conventionally called economics, which was originally called political economics before they removed the term political. We could talk more about the reasons why they did that, but use your imagination. I think you can come up with some reasons why they might want to eliminate the word political in the kind of work they do. In any case, please post any questions. Again, we're using VoiceThread here. So any thoughts, comments, reactions, questions, objections, grievances, post them. There have been a few postings in VoiceThread so far this semester, the first week, but not many. So I am using this particular program for that purpose. And if people don't take advantage of that, there are probably other ways I can be recording these lectures that would involve fewer steps and would be somewhat less cumbersome. So let's get started. And before we do anything else, somebody had asked me about this flag here. Looks like the American flag, and they were wondering what it was, or is it the American flag? You probably can't see it clearly. It's not the American flag as you know it. I don't post the flag. I don't wave the flag. It's not outside my house. I don't have a flag lapel. For philosophical reasons, I do not support the concept of patriotism, which is often associated with flag waving, or nationalism. There's a lot more we could say about those two concepts and the value of them, and also the dysfunctional aspects of what I call patriotism and nationalism. But these are not things or sentiments which I express. I didn't say the pledge to the flag when I was in high school for a variety of reasons. And I pretty much have sustained my view about pledging allegiance to a flag. I have issues with that. That's my problem, not your problem. There's a lot we could say about it. And not everyone agrees with me on that. That's perfectly fine. So what is this that I have behind me then, if it isn't the American flag, if I'm not trying to, as politicians always do, wrap themselves in the American flag? I don't know if you've noticed this, but at the last two, at the convention, and anytime there's kind of a political statement, you will see a politician standing in front of like 20 or 30 flags behind them. The Democrats do this because they're always a little defensive about the fact that maybe they're not patriotic enough. So it's kind of a defense mechanism. I find it to be kind of a shameless form of pandering to trying to communicate that you are indeed a good American patriot. It's unnecessary as far as I'm concerned, but it is a part of what we might call in sociology, civil religion. So what is this flag? Let me just show you briefly what it is. That's what it is. Now, if you've ever heard of Adbusters, you can go to their website. It's a organization. They've been around for a while. And it's a very critical analysis that they engage in of American patterns of materialism, consumerism, also critical of American foreign policy, and of the domination of our entire system and our way of thinking and our psyche by large corporations. And so this is obviously not a celebration of the United States. It's actually a criticism of the United States, where you see these stars representing states, you see corporations. The message is that these corporations are essentially controlling what happens in the United States and largely dictating what we do, what we think, how we spend our time, and how we certainly spend our money. So check out the Adbusters website. I contribute to the organization. I have a subscription to their lively, colorful, image-filled, and provocative, very edgy, very subversive publications. I like what they do. And some of you might find it interesting. So that's the flag that's up there, and somebody had asked me about that. Okay, let's get to the lecture. I want to begin by emphasizing that you can't really, and I think I mentioned this at the beginning of the semester, we are integrating politics and economics in this course in a very big way. What I call political economy. Political economy is a whole area, and it's one of the areas that I specialize in as a sociologist. And you can't understand much about the political system unless you understand something about the way the economic system works. And that economic system is capitalism. That's what we call it. We don't call it the free market. We don't call it free enterprise. It's a capitalist system. So if you think about the capitalist economy, there are two necessary conditions for capitalist economic growth, capitalist economic expansion. What Marxists, you sometimes might hear this term, capital accumulation. A very Marxian term, but basically we're talking about growth, expansion of a capitalist economy in most simplistic terms. So there are two necessary conditions for the capitalist economy to expand and grow and to have capital accumulation. The first is you must have a capacity to produce. And notice I put in parentheses there, supply, okay? Capacity to produce, what does that mean? It means that the economy will not in any way expand or grow. There will be no capital accumulation if capitalists do not invest their money. That's what I mean by the capacity to produce. There must be a capacity to encourage capitalists to take the money, the capital, the financial resources they have, and invest it in production. They are only going to do that if they perceive that that investment will translate into profit. That is a return on investment. ROI, as they say over in business school, okay? So you have to have conditions. You can just think of this as like the business climate. You have to have conditions that are ripe for capital investment. And that means conditions that encourage the capitalist to invest their money in anticipation of making a profit. If they do not believe they're going to make a sufficient profit, they will not invest their money. If they don't invest their money, we're all screwed. Because a capitalist economy depends on the private investment decisions of capitalists. This is one of the major criticisms one can make of capitalism. So you have to have a capacity to produce. Secondly, you have to have a capacity to consume. And what that means is that the goods and the services that are being generated and produced by the capital investment must be purchased, must be consumed, must be bought by people who have money. This is the demand side. You understand? So there's the supply, the production side, capacity to produce, and there's a capacity to consume, the demand side. If capitalists produce enormous amounts of goods, but they can't sell them, they don't make a profit, right? So you have to have, on the one hand, capacity to produce, conditions that encourage investment, and a capacity to consume that is sufficient amount of money in the hands of people to purchase what is being produced. Demand. Okay. Now, one of the wonderful things about Marxist theory is that it identifies all of the many inherent contradictions that exist in capitalist economies. That's one of the beautiful aspects of Marxist analysis. I know that you read a little bit about Marx in the first reading by Janowitz. That doesn't even scratch the surface of the value of Marxian analysis, which is the inner workings of the capitalist economy. So let's consider one of the most significant contradictions, and I think this is something everybody can grasp, and it's fundamental. There's a whole series of contradictions. This is just one, but to me, it's a very central contradiction of capitalism. On the one hand, if you want to encourage capitalists to invest their money, the capacity to produce, you have to have low costs and you have to have low wages. Capitalists aren't going to invest their money if they have to pay workers so much that they're not going to make the level of profit they demand or anticipate or desire. So the capacity to produce, encouraging investment, keep wages low. On the other hand, and I think you're beginning to see where I'm going here, the capacity to consume, that is the ability for the capitalists after they produce all these goods cheaply to sell them and realize the profit, depends on higher wages. That is, that people have to have sufficient amounts of income to buy the goods. Fundamental contradiction in capitalist economies. Okay, so that's the first point I want to make. This is simply one way to think about the way the capitalist economy works. And ultimately, if you understand these two concepts, you can understand how certain kinds of economic crises emerge in a capitalist economy. And I'm going to give examples from American economic history. All right, so let's consider two different kinds of crises. One is a demand-side crisis, okay? Now, we call it a demand-side crisis. This is when the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, they're very strong. They impose their conditions on the society, on the economy, on the working class. And when they do this, if they're powerful enough, they keep wages very, very low, okay? Because they want to maximize profit. The lower the wages, the higher the profit, all things being equal, okay? So when the capitalist class is very strong, the capacity to consume tends to be weak because the capitalists are exercising their political power to keep wages low. This creates what's called a wage squeeze, which produces a demand-side crisis. Now, it's a demand-side crisis because wages are low, capitalists can produce cheaply, but they can't sell the goods that they're producing because wages are insufficient. Okay? That's a demand-side crisis. And I have this little mathematical equation, CTP, the capacity to produce, is more powerful, greater than the capacity to consume. So when capitalists talk about different kinds of crisis, they talk about a wage squeeze crisis, a crisis where wages are too low for the mass of citizens, the mass of the population, to consume what is being produced. This is a problem. Okay. Now, what about a supply side crisis? Think about the other side. When labor is relatively strong, I'm going to say relatively strong because labor is never in the driver's seat in the capitalist economy because they're in a dependent position vis-a-vis the capitalist class. But let's say labor develops some organizational strength. We'll talk about that. Okay. This could be through labor unions, etc., workplace power, working class power. When labor is strong and they're able to bring up their wages and their salaries and demand certain kinds of working conditions of the capitalist class, this increases costs. And as the costs rise, remember, the capacity to produce is weakened because now capitalists look at the situation. They say, well, costs are rising, labor is too strong, wages are too high, we can't make a sufficient profit. I'm not going to invest. You understand? Now I have that little mathematical formula. The capacity to consume is greater than the capacity to produce. That's a profit squeeze. You understand? One is a wage squeeze, producing a demand-side crisis, profit squeeze, supply-side crisis. And that crisis originates when capitalists decide not to invest, the economy slows down, it goes into recession, you have unemployment, etc. So again, this contradiction, this relationship between the capacity to produce and the capacity to consume. Okay. So let's go back to the Great Depression. By the way, there have been books, thousands of books and articles written on the Great Depression and what caused it and what factors contributed to the economic crisis of the 1930s. We're going to spend, like 5 minutes. Okay. So this is a simplified view. And my analysis of the Great Depression is in the context of that contradiction between the capacity to produce and the capacity to consume. So the crisis of the 1930s, the Great Depression, was a demand-side crisis. And what I mean by that is, at that time, 1920s, you had very, very favorable capacity to produce conditions. You had a large influx of immigrant labor, so you had surplus labor. Labor unions did not really exist to any extent. So workers were not well organized. And you had the beginning of a mass production industrial system that could produce many goods rapidly and productively. The beginnings of the assembly line. So labor surplus, lots of immigrant labor coming to the United States, poorly organized, not in labor unions, new technologies. All of this contributed to a very favorable investment climate. The capacity to produce was very favorable. And there was massive amounts of investment and speculation. That's the key point. Speculation. Produce lots of goods because conditions are ripe for investment, anticipating a high level of profit. So that's what happened. Lots of investment, lots of speculation about an expanding economy, high profits, etc. But what was missing? Yes, we had a strong capacity to produce. What didn't we have during that time? A good capacity to consume. Wages were very, very low. And so you had a crisis of what's sometimes called underconsumption. All right, underconsumption. Insufficient ability of the population to consume all of the goods that the capitalists are investing in. If the capitalists can't invest and make a profit by selling the goods, you're going to have a crisis. All right. So that it's sometimes called a realization crisis in Marxist theory. What that means is that capitalists can produce cheaply, but they can't realize. They can't realize the profit. So just imagine you're producing lots of goods very cheaply because wages are low, workers are disorganized, there's a labor surplus, you can keep wages as low as possible, pay people the minimum, produce lots of goods very cheaply, you put them in a warehouse, you still haven't realized the profit. There's a lot of profit embedded, potential profit embedded in each one of those little items, little commodities that you've produced, but you don't realize the profit until that product is exchanged in a market for money. And if there isn't sufficient money in the hands of capital of the population, workers, you don't realize profit and you have a crisis. All right, so how did we get out of this mess? Well, there's lots of explanations and theories about this, but we do know that one of the things that happened and that came out of this crisis was a reorganization of the political economic system of the United States under FDR. And some of you are familiar, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, some of you are familiar with his history. And he was not a socialist. He was not a communist. He was actually from a very wealthy family. He was a capitalist himself, or at least he came from capitalist roots. And he realized that the political economic system, ultimately, to get the United States out of this crisis, had to be reorganized. And this brings us to what's called the New Deal. Okay? And the New Deal was essentially designed to have massive amounts of government spending and investment in the economy in order to stimulate demand. You understand? Put money in the hands of workers. You had jobs programs, you had infrastructure programs, you had all kinds of conservation corps programs. It's an amazing moment in American history where you see the state, the government stepping in and ultimately, really, I would say, saving capitalism from itself. This is the great irony, is that what people call socialism, some people call the New Deal from socialism, actually saved capitalism. Because capitalism is a self-destructive system, and it has to be bailed out, constantly. And this is the case historically in the United States. So, under the New Deal, you have the introduction of Social Security, social insurance programs to make sure that people have money to spend when they're old, when they're retired. You have progressive taxation and redistribution, which means you tax the rich, the wealthiest. Tax rates went up, and that money was spent on government programs, on redistribution, putting money ultimately in the hands of the population that could spend it. You had the National Labor Relations Act, or what was called the Wagner Act, that allowed unions to be formed in organizations, in workplaces, in factories. And so you had a sharp rise in the percentage of workers who were unionized and who could negotiate for a higher wage. And you had this expansion of the social welfare state. All of this is part of the New Deal. You understand? So in order to resolve the demand side crisis, you have to put money into the hands of people. And the private sector isn't going to do that. The state steps in. This is what's called Keynesian economic policy. Okay? John Maynard Keynes, maybe you've heard of John Maynard Keynes, the economist, British economist, and his theory was that capitalist economies inevitably will suffer from these demand side shortages, demand side crises, and the only way to get out of them is for the government to spend money in a variety of ways. And another way they could spend money is to expand the military. And so I have a term here called military Keynesianism. It's a pretty neat little concept. And the idea there is that spending on war actually stimulates the economy. Sadly. Clearly, I think we would all want to stimulate economic growth and expansion and increase wages and create jobs in ways that aren't related to human suffering and destruction. But anyway, and remember, we had World War II, okay? And during World War II, it was, it wasn't like, well, we have lots of needs that have to be met during the war to make sure that we can, provide the troops. We didn't leave that to the market, by the way. We had essentially a command economy during wartime, directed by the government, right? And massive amounts of money being pumped in. Okay, that got us out of the Great Depression and the economic hardship of that period. Okay, so then we move into this, what's called the post-war period. When I say post-war, I mean post-World War II. It's important to point that out because we live in a period now where we have permanent war, right? We're told the war on terror is permanent. And so for your generation, the idea of post-war may not make much sense. But if you read historical pieces, when people use the term post-war, they mean post-World War II. So World War II ends. You have in place a kind of Keynesian political economic system. You have this New Deal. You have social legislation. You have a social welfare state. And you have the beginning of the expansion of various agencies within the federal government designed to ensure the safety of workers, the safety of food, etc. Okay, we'll talk more about some of those agencies throughout this semester and what they do or what they aren't doing. But a very important part of this period, this post-World War II period, and when I say this, let's just say the period from about 1945 to 1975, okay? Those were really the glory years of American capitalism, right? And during this period, there was something called a capital labor accord. And you can think of this as a kind of agreement between the capitalist class and the working class, which actually ensured that workers were well rewarded and compensated for an extended period of time during this period. And the Capital Labor Accord essentially worked this way. Labor unions were very widespread, particularly in the manufacturing sector of the economy at this time. Labor unions essentially came to an agreement with the capitalist class. Okay, that's what it's called, Capital Labor Accord, an agreement. And it went something like this. The workers said, look, now if they're really socialists, they say, we want to take over the workplace. Workers' control of the means of production, making all decisions. They decided there was a compromise. They said to the owners, we'll let the managers that you've hired decide how work is organized. All right. You turn that over to managers. Workers no longer have control over the way the workplace is organized. You turn that over to managers. We'll let the managers figure that out. They can assign people to different positions. They can organize the assembly line the way they want, et cetera, et cetera. We will concede that on the condition that as productivity rises, wages and salaries rise proportionally. You understand? There is a relationship between increasing productivity and increasing wages. This was the Capital Labor Accord. So I have this term here, the social structure of accumulation. Some people have talked about phases of capital expansion, and they call it a social structure of accumulation. Remember, I used this term accumulation before. Social structure. So there are phases of capitalist expansion that involve having in place particular arrangements and institutions, like the Capital Labor Accord, that agreement. Some people have called the Capital Labor Accord the social structure of accumulation during this post-war period. Okay. Some people call it a Keynesian Fordist model. Now, notice I have something called, in the parentheses there, non-zero sum logic. This is important, the non-zero sum logic, right? In a zero sum situation, any gain for one side is a loss to the other. That's a zero sum gain. And that produces high levels of conflict and antagonism, okay? Because any gain for workers would be regarded as a direct cost to capitalists and vice versa. Okay? So in this arrangement, the capitalist class, to some extent, okay, accepted this accord. And basically, they agreed to this non-zero sum logic, which was, yes, paying workers a higher wage obviously is not what we want to do. We want to keep wages as low as possible. We want to maximize profit. But we realize that if we're going to sell all of the products in this mass production economy to the population, they need to have higher wages. You understand? So Henry Ford was, the person, often the example, Henry Ford, $5 a day, how are you going to sell the automobiles if you don't pay your workers enough to buy them, right? That's basically the idea. So it was a non-zero sum logic. Yes, it's a cost to us to pay workers more, but there's also a benefit to that because those workers then turn around and spend the money. So this social structure of accumulation, you can call it the New Deal arrangement, you can call it the Capital Labor Accord, the Fordist model, there's lots of terms that people have used. This fueled the most prolific expansion period of capitalist growth in our history, period. These were the glory years, right, of 1950 to 1973, okay? I said 45 to 75, roughly that period, okay? Almost everything we talk about today in regards to the amazing aspects of American capitalism really pertain to that period. So you might ask yourself, was that an anomaly? Maybe this isn't really the character of American capitalism. Maybe that was just an anomalous period that was unusual for a variety of reasons having to do with the Great Depression and then World War II and then, American global dominate, whatever, right? We'll talk about what happens later. Who's that? I can't hear you. Okay, well, you're not here. That's Tricky Dick. That's what we called him back in the day. Dick Nixon, Richard Nixon, criminal, left office in disgrace. He was my nemesis, I have to say. When I was in high school, I was very political in high school. And the one thing that energized me more than anything else and probably shaped my entire political outlook if you want to talk about political socialization, was the Vietnam War, a horrible, disgusting exercise in American imperialism, a criminal enterprise that had horrible impact, certainly on the Vietnamese people, the Cambodian people, the Laotian people, and of course, it had enormous impact on American politics and lives of Americans. You should do a little research on the Vietnam War because it's one of those things that maybe some people have forgotten. In any case, I could go on and on, but he was my nemesis, and he energized my vitriol and hatred in some ways. But he's a Republican. And remember, he's a Republican. He said, "We are all Keynesians now," or at least he would. People attribute that quote to him. There's some dispute about these quotes, but and it's true to some extent that even though he was a Republican, and by the way, if Nixon were alive today and he was pursuing the policies he pursued then, he would be drummed out of the Republican Party because he would be too liberal in their view. And he would be too liberal because one of the things that Nixon did was he did pretty much subscribe to the idea that government did have some role to play, even though he's a Republican. And, he had certain kinds of conservative principles. During his administration, you had the creation of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. That's to protect workers. Today, much of the Republican Party would like to eliminate OSHA, or at least roll back what they do. Environmental Protection Agency. What? Yes, a Republican Environmental Protection Agency. Today, Republicans would probably like to eliminate that because it interferes with the free market and the ability of corporations to make more profit. Clean water, clean air bills. So there were domestically, there's lots of issues I have with some of his domestic politics, but domestically he was to some extent subscribing to a kind of Keynesian framework. And so we have this funny quote coming from, of course, his foreign policy is what, ultimately produced the protests and the hatred toward Nixon, who, when he came in office, said he was going to end the Vietnam War, and he actually expanded it. And okay, I could go on and on about that. All right. I hope you can see this. Let me see if I can move this thing. Can I move this? Oh, where am I going to move? What the hell is this? All right. I can't move it. So I'm just going to leave it there for now because I'll screw things up. So something happened in the 1970s. There was a desire by the capitalist class. At a certain point, the capitalist class were getting a little restive, if you want to call it that. And there was a presentation by Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice, to the Chamber of Commerce. And it was a call to arms. And basically what Powell was saying, and I'm not going to read this, you can read it, it's very interesting. You can read the whole memo if you go online. It's widely cited as kind of a critical point in American political economic history. And that is that Powell essentially said, look, things have gotten out of hand. The New Deal has gone too far. Workers have too much power. There's an attack on the free enterprise system. We as capitalists, we as conservatives, we who value the free enterprise system need to, mount a counteroffensive against this expansion. I would call it an expansion of democracy. And that's one aspect of neoliberalism I'll talk about. But this Powell memo was a call to arms. Enough of the New Deal, enough of the expansion of government. This is intruding on the property rights of the capitalist class. All right, so let me be a little more specific about the four things that the capitalist class began to complain about. And here's where we began to move into, this was the next major economic crisis we had after the Great Depression was the crisis of the 1970s and into the early 1980s. This was not a demand-side crisis. Remember, the demand-side crisis of the Great Depression was based on the fact that workers did not have enough money in their hands to buy the goods that were being produced. This was a supply side crisis that emerged because the capitalist class didn't like the conditions that had emerged over the post-war period. And over time, they decided we can't make enough profit. Conditions aren't favorable. We don't like the business climate. We are going to stop investing. And when you stop investing, if you're a capitalist, and the capitalist class does this generally, we all get screwed because the economy slows down, we go into recession, we have unemployment. Not a good situation. All right, so what were the complaints? And I have them here. Taxes are too high, regulations are too stringent, unions are too strong, and the welfare state is too generous. I want you to remember those three things: taxes, regulations, unions, and the welfare state. Those are the four items that the capitalist class took aim at. They wanted taxes lower. They wanted deregulation. They wanted unions to be weakened or eliminated. And they wanted the welfare state to be rolled back. There were these jokes, free the Fortune 500, because, they were complaining that they were being, enslaved by the New Deal political economic system because taxes were too high. There were too many regulations. Unions are too strong. The welfare state was too generous. It would give people money even though they weren't working. It's the last thing a capitalist wants ever, is to have people able to survive without selling their labor power for a wage. So you have disinvestment, underinvestment, you have recession. We go into this supply side crisis. Okay, so as I said, the supply side crisis, the capacity to consume is stronger than the capacity to produce. Remember, workers have some relative strength over this period. That produces the supply side crisis. This is a profit squeeze, right? Not a wage squeeze. Wages were pretty high at this time. Okay. And by the way, the mid-70s was the point at which the level of economic inequality was the lowest in the United States. Think about that. So the success of programs produces a backlash by the capitalist class. So you have the profit squeeze. It's sometimes called a capital strike, right? In other words, workers strike by withdrawing their labor power. They leave the workplace. Or you could have a capital strike. That is where the capitalists say, you know what, we're not investing. And when the capitalists engage in a capital strike, the economy gets screwed. If it's a capitalist economy where the entire economy and its ability to grow and expand and employ people depends on the private investment decisions of capitalists. The Achilles heel of capitalism. So what's the solution? Neoliberalism. Now, at the time, this wasn't the term that was used. So you have the 1970s, you have Nixon leaving office, you have Jimmy Carter being elected, you have Gerald Ford filled in for Nixon when he resigned. Ford lost the election to Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter loses the election in a pretty severe beat down to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is a Republican. And Ronald Reagan, to a large extent, ushers in this neoliberal model. And in the early stages, some people called it Reaganomics. Some people called it supply side economics, supply side, because the idea is to put in place conditions that encourage investment, which makes some economic sense. Market fundamentalism. The market is the fundamental driver, and we should eliminate anything that interferes with the market and let the market do its magic. Okay. Voodoo economics. We'll talk more about that later because that has some specific reference. All right. So neoliberalism becomes the way to describe what essentially is the political economic arrangements that have existed in the United States since 1980. This is a very, very 40 years of a neoliberal political economic model. There's an ideological dimension. There's a policy dimension. The ideological dimension is markets are good, governments are bad. Private is better than public. If the government has any role, it's to create conditions that encourage investment. You understand? The role of government is to create conditions that encourage capital investment, not to do anything that might discourage capital investment. Okay? And the role of government is also to protect the market from democratic demands. We'll talk more about this conflict between capitalism and democracy. Some people assume they go hand in hand. In fact, they're fundamentally antagonistic to one another. So you have this ideology, this sort of anti-government, a privatization, anti-public sector, anti-public goods, let the market decide philosophy, market fundamentalism, okay? And then you've got the policies, right? If taxes are too high, you need to lower them. If regulations are too stringent, you need deregulation. If unions are too strong, you need to beat up on unions. And if the welfare state is too generous, you need to reduce the welfare state. By the way, at that time, welfare was not unpopular. If you asked most people, there were surveys done, about, do you think people, when they're suffering from economic hard times, should have access to welfare relief? Questions like that. There was a majority who said, yes, of course, people suffer from economic hard times. So one thing that Reagan did, and this has enormous political consequences over the long haul, one thing that Reagan did was that he essentially began to describe people who receive welfare in racist terms. He talked about the welfare Cadillac, okay? People receiving welfare drive Cadillacs, welfare queens, okay? Now, these are dog whistles, okay? These communicate to people that those who are getting welfare actually don't deserve it. It's a certain segment of the population. What they're saying is it's largely black and brown people who aren't working, who don't deserve it. We get this term that emerges, the deserving and the undeserving poor. And you begin to turn people against welfare because you give them the impression that A, it's not deserved, that people could be working, but instead they're on the dole, and it's the other that is engaged in this behavior. So he uses that method, that technique that has run through American politics and emerges to this very day when Trump talks about the end of the suburbs. People are coming to destroy the suburbs. We know who he's talking about. Okay. He doesn't really use the dog whistle, right? They say he uses the bullhorn. So this is not the first time, but certainly a way to get people to support the cutbacks in welfare because, again, there was massive amounts of support. Right? Now, the thing is, everyone knew that these policies, okay, this Reaganomic policy set, the supply side economic policies, what became known as neoliberalism. Everyone knew that in the short run, over time, this was going to put more and more wealth and income in the hands of the capitalist class. There was no question about it. Every aspect of what they were asking for would have essentially a redistribution effect. When people talk about redistribution, they often think about redistribution from the capitalist class to working. No, this is redistribution from the bottom and the middle up to the top. Right? How did they justify this? They justified it by indicating that, yes, there will be a period where there will be rising inequality, concentration of income and wealth, but that wealth and income will be concentrated in the hands of the doers and the makers and the capitalist class, and they will take all that money that they have and they'll see how wonderful the economic environment is for investment, and they will reinvest all that money and we will have a massive renaissance of economic expansion and an expansion of employment and jobs and industry. And so, yes, the income will go up at the beginning, but eventually it will all trickle down. That was the promise. That was one of the ways in which they got away with this. Here's a few quotes. I just like to show these because it gives you sort of a sense of the flavor of the ideological message. And I'm going to talk more about these because they have a direct impact on the current ability of U.S. Political economic system to manage the greatest crisis we faced since the Great Depression, the pandemic. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. Okay, you understand? This is part of the neoliberal ideology. Ronald Reagan, when he was running for office, and by the way, people now, they look back at Ronald Reagan and, they say, Reagan Republicans. I'm a Reagan Republican. Let me tell you something. First of all, before Reagan became president, he was considered a buffoon and a kind of a joke. And there were people, just like before Trump was elected, who said, if Reagan wins, I'm leaving the country. Okay? So there's that aspect of history that you may not know about when people glorify the Reagan years. The other is the Reagan years weren't so wonderful, especially because he instituted these kinds of policies and this kind of ideology. The 10 most dangerous words in English language are, hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. So the idea was the government had no significant positive role to play at all. And this became a deep-seated ideology that is communicated to Americans, to you as you're growing up. You ask the typical person, you want a private solution or a public? Oh, private solution's got to be better. Market or government? Oh, market. I believe in the market. It's all ideology. And then you have Margaret Thatcher, who was the British Prime Minister, who also, at the same time, was promoting neoliberalism in Britain. Okay, so how did they resolve, so to speak, the economic crisis of the 1970s? Well, they did exactly what you would expect. They responded to the demands of the capitalist class. They cut taxes, particularly on the wealthy and on business. They eliminated government regulations, deregulation. This has been going on for 30 years, this deregulation movement. And most Americans, again, are brainwashed into thinking, regulations are bad, deregulations are good. Okay. Weakening labor unions, all kinds of efforts to make it more difficult for workers to join unions, and policies which directly attacked labor unions. These were promoted. And by the way, people thought this is good because, labor unions raise costs, and if costs go up, capitalists aren't going to invest, so we need to get rid of labor unions because they're screwing up the economy. And of course, attacking and gutting the welfare state. And the reason you want to do that is you want to force more and more workers into the labor market. You never want workers to be able to receive income without working, right? And you remove restrictions on the mobility of capital. This is another aspect of it, okay, during this period. Because capital, during this period, and I talk more about this in my Social Change and International Development course because we talk about globalization in depth, and that is the freedom of capital to move across borders to other countries with very favorable tax consequences. So any restrictions on capital mobility, all that kind of stuff, all of this is a part of the package, okay? The neoliberal package. Okay, so some of this I've already mentioned. I try to continue to get people to just think about the various ways in which you can conceptualize this idea of neoliberalism because it's so important. But one source of confusion, can you hear that? Okay, I got these neighbors with these, garden tools. And it just pisses me off how often they use them. All right, in any case, so one point I want to make is it's a source of confusion is this idea of neoliberalism. People are sometimes confused by this because they think liberalism is Democratic Party liberalism. Isn't that sort of left-leaning, or isn't that, pro-worker, or, there's some confusion there. The liberalism we're talking about here is not American-style Democratic Party liberalism. What we're talking about here is classical, philosophical liberalism. Classical liberal theory is very much pro-market, anti-government intervention. Okay? There's much more I could say about classical liberal theory, but we're talking about liberalism. The way people describe liberalism in Europe and in Britain, it doesn't mean sort of welfare state policies, Democratic Party policies. It means market-based policies. So new liberalism, okay? Taking the philosophy of liberalism, classical liberalism, and introducing it neo in the contemporary setting, right? That's what we mean here. Okay, so don't confuse this with liberalism. Okay, it's an entirely different thing. Okay, so these are some additional points that I think I've already covered. All right, so what are the consequences of neoliberalism that we've witnessed over the last 30 plus years? One is de-industrialization. I told you that the limits on capital mobility have been knocked down. So you have factories closing, moving, shifting resources, shifting investment from the Northeast and the Midwest. You have, cities and communities that are entirely devastated because the entire economy revolved around a particular company, factory, the production of something in that region, in that community. Those factories close. Those communities are devastated. They are economically depressed. The prototypical case is Detroit. Detroit at one time, Motortown, was the center of manufacturing, productivity, expansion, high wages, comfortable blue-collar working jobs. Look at Detroit today. Okay. And if you grew up in Florida, you don't realize this, but if you drive through the Midwest and the Northeast, through these old factory towns, you see what happened. So you have deindustrialization, and then the first phase is moving a lot of the factories and the investment from the Midwest, Northeast to the Sun Belt, right? The Sun Belt, the South, which is much more accommodating to the interest of capitalists, weak unions, not much of a history of labor organization, and a very pro-capitalist, pro-free market orientation. And then eventually, of course, the capitalists, they want to make even higher profits. Let's just shift everything offshore to China and to Mexico, et cetera. Right? Financialization, the financial sector of the economy continues to expand in relationship to the goods-producing economy. We'll talk more about that. We have fiscal crises. That is, you have this massive pressure to reduce taxes, and that means that you have less revenue coming in, but you have often the same level of requirements for states to meet basic needs, and so you have fiscal crises. We had the great financial recession, great financial crisis, and you have stagnation. You have stagnation of wages over this period, and you have largely a very stagnating economy. The levels of economic growth during the neoliberal period are much, much weaker and smaller, if you want to focus on economic growth as one measure, than prior periods in economic history. So when people say that the neoliberal model, unleashed the market and produced this massive expansion of the economy, it's simply not true. We've had relatively modest rates of growth. On the other hand, you've had massive, massive levels of profit concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. So David Harvey, if you haven't read anything by David Harvey, and I think I did have some readings of Harvey in the past. I know I do in my Social Change and International Development. In any case, David Harvey is a Marxist, geographer, anthropologist, social science person, whatever you want to call him, very interdisciplinary. He's written wonderful accounts of neoliberalism. So if you're interested in learning more about the meaning of neoliberalism, the intricacies of it, I would strongly encourage you to check out David Harvey. He's got some great YouTube presentations where he sort of lays out on a board, a whiteboard, all kinds of different features of the way capitalism operates generally and neoliberalism in particular. And his point is neoliberalism was from the very beginning a project to achieve the restoration of class power. You have to understand these periods of expansion and growth and transition as a function of the balance of economic power. And remember, it was a capitalist class. It was very upset during the 1970s, the expansion of the New Deal, expansion of states, expansion of the government. They wanted to restore their power, class power. So a political project to reestablish the conditions of capital accumulation, restore the power of economic elites. And they did that. They were very successful. And the United States stands out today as the most extreme neoliberal industrialized economy in the world. And that explains a lot of why we are where we are today. Okay, I think this is going to end at 60 minutes, so I'm going to just say a couple quick things, and then I'm going to have to end part one. Okay, so under neoliberalism, you have de-industrialization. I mentioned that before. There was this wonderful book written, and I think this is 1982. This book had a huge, huge impact on the way I was thinking about my own work, my own research. I wrote a few papers on the migration of capital from one geographic area to another. The de-industrialization of America. You have, as again, I mentioned that you have this attack on labor, and you have this steady decline in the percent of the workforce that is a member of a union. Okay, this has enormous political and economic consequences for the United States. And most students, with all due respect, are utterly ignorant about the role of labor unions, the history of unions in the United States, the critical role that unions play politically, and that's why I devote an entire week to labor and politics, because you can't understand many things about what's happened over the last 30 to 40 years if you don't understand what has happened to labor, right? And notice that most of the workforce that is now unionized are in public sector unions, not private sector unions, which have been essentially devastated, demolished, eliminated. Okay, I'm going to stop here because I want to say more about this chart because it's very important, and it will take more than 2 minutes because I'm at 58 minutes. So I will stop here. That is the end of part one. I hope you are appreciating the importance of this idea of neoliberalism. Again, it's absolutely vital for your understanding of what the hell is happening. And not just domestically, there's also global neoliberalism. So if you can begin to get an understanding of this, it will explain a lot of what's happened over the last 40 years and the political dynamics that currently exist in the United States. Okay, I will see you in part two.